I am delighted to be moderating this discussion today, How Ukraine Will Change the World, and we'll talk about that name to begin with in a few minutes. The three speakers that we have today all have really fascinating perspectives on this question, and it's a real pleasure for all of us to get to hear from them today. So I'll start at the far end. Ivan Krastev, political scientist, head of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Nataliya Gumenyuk, the curator of our focus theme here at Knyzhkovy Arsenal, head of and founder of PIJL, Public Interest Journalism Lab, and of the Reckoning Project. And Henrik Fredriksson, essayist, editor, the co-founder and longtime head of Eurozine, a really wonderful network of cultural journals across Europe. So today, all, thank you for being here to have this discussion. And you know, the title of the panel, right, is pointedly in the future tense. How will Ukraine change the world? But I think to understand how that is going to happen, we may have to think about what's happened since the full-scale invasion and even before that. And Ivan, maybe I'll start with you here and ask you, what was it? Because we all had this sense that we woke up, right, this is a commonplace now. There was an awakening on February 24th, surprise, and then surprise days, weeks, months later as Ukrainians continued to resist. And that, in a certain sense, has changed Europe, has changed the world. How do you see that moment of surprise?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and for the great privilege to be here. And for a visitor, for somebody who comes, and this is my first visit after February 24, the most surreal story is how normal the city looks. And you know that it is not. When you go on the streets and basically you can imagine that there is no war, but there is a war. I'm saying this because answering these questions, I want to make just very simple story. From the outside perspective, in order to understand how much Europe, let's not talk about the world, has already changed, you should try to understand why it was so difficult for the Europeans to believe that there are going to be a full-fledged war. And listen, many people are going to claim because Europe was naive about Russia. Part of this, not the most important. For the Europeans to accept that there's going to be a major war in Europe today, it means to question three of the major assumptions on which European project is built. First, that economic interdependence is the major source of security. That if trade very much with somebody, you're never going to fight each other. Second, that military power doesn't matter. Europeans, particularly after the American war in Iraq, we managed to convince ourselves that spending on defense does not make sense. And then suddenly, when the basically war, full-fledged war started, Ukraine has ammunition for 6 weeks. Germany had for 2 days. And the third thing that is also critically important in this was that suddenly, if you believe that this is possible, what it means for you. It means that everything on which you have been hoped and betted is just an illusion. This is why the moment the war in this form started, for Europe it was a dramatic change. It was a cultural change. It was not a policy change. The second surprise was why Ukraine had the will and the capacity to resist. It's not going to come for you as a surprise that while the Americans were very much kind of more precise than Europeans, what Russians will do, the expectations was that basically Ukraine is going to sustain basically resistance for several weeks. And listen, I'm not going to go on the military story. I'm even not going to praise Ukraine. For the Europeans, it also means we rediscovered two things: the transformative power of defensive nationalism. And listen, Europe is post-national project. Europeans agreed with Bertolt Brecht that you should feel pity for nations that need heroes. And suddenly you understand that if you don't have heroes, you don't have freedom. And this is also a kind of a major change for a generation that was totally post-war. And the third thing that came as a major surprise was how differently the non-Western world reacted. I was part of a big survey that European Council on Foreign Relations did, not on how the governments in the Western world reacted, how the publics reacted. And the truth is that 64% of the Indians believe that Russia is an ally, and 65% of them believe that the United States is an ally. This major dividing story that you see in Europe are not going up there. And it is not going up there for three reasons that I also find important talking about what is happening. It is not about Ukraine. And this is, I don't believe that Ukrainians should kind of blame themselves that others don't understand what is happening. For outside world, it's not about Ukraine. For many countries, it's about the United States. In Africa, it's about imperial colonial legacy. But it is also about the special role of Europe. In the imagination of these people, you cannot be colonized and being white at the same time. And this is part of, I do believe, failure of Eastern Europe to tell the story, not now, but for a longer period of time. And I'm going to end up on this. I was rereading these days Richard Kapuscinski, the famous Polish writer and journalist that have been covered in his life 27 revolutions and coups d'etats in 60s, 70s, and 80s. So he was probably the most famous journalist covering the decolonization. And do you know why he was so successful? Because he was going in all these countries, be Latin America, be Africa, and said, I know more about colonizations than you. I'm a Pole. I know what it means to be colonized. Funnily enough, we never managed to tell this story. And because we never managed to tell the story, we basically are in a situation in which others said, listen, what Russia is doing is bad. But this is what the great powers do anyways. There is nothing exceptional about this. And in my view, this is an intellectual challenge. And this is an intellectual challenge in which, for the Europeans, in order to convince others, we should tell our own story differently.
This point precisely about storytelling is going to be one of the ways, I think, in which Ukraine can change the world, right? If it finds ways to tell these stories to others, and if Ukrainians find ways to match the story to the people they're talking to. And Nataliya, I know this is something that you've been thinking about a lot and working on a lot, is, for example, what sorts of stories are going to resonate with Latin American audiences, with African audiences, with all the diversity that that itself entails, and then how then are new alliances, new allies, new connections being forged?
So I'm here I'm wearing a couple of hats, yes, so you see this team when everything matters, and I was happy to invite you to this panel with particular thinking what we will discuss, because I really think that the first article I wrote after the so-called Euromaidan revolution was that it's not the Euromaidan revolution for me, because I'm speaking about the universal values. It's not about just, freedoms, human rights, and other things. And I was very firm about always trying to say that, do you think, people elsewhere do not, deserve the same freedoms and rights? And we shouldn't, bound ourselves and, focus just on this, because it's something bigger. And if we really focus just on that, we kind of lose a lot of solidarity, and it's harder to tell. And it makes it very hard to tell the story beyond Europe. And I see it's partially already now. I'm in this interesting, so for me, this theme which we are discussing, it's about the reality check of the values, let's say, the civilized world is living. Let us use this term, maybe, I don't know if it's the right one or not. So if, human rights don't matter here, then, and if we can't defend them here, then where? If we cannot reach the accountability and put the accountable for the war crimes with this amount of abundance of evidence and with this openness, then where? If with this political will and support we really can't change things, it means that the whole system is flawed. And I always trying, also speaking to international audience, as a Ukrainian, I'm telling something this, I'm being here, being Ukrainian, English speaking, well connected, writing English. Probably if I would need to leave Ukraine, I'll find my way somewhere, in European academia, in Western paper, in an American institution, and in any other fellowship. But for what? What then I will write? what then I will discuss? Human rights? That would be nonsense. That would be hypocrisy. Then I actually need to change all my ideals and mean they are nothing, kind of start anything from the scratch. So for me, Ukraine is both the testing ground where we have the reality check of all the, let's say, positive values we have, but also the place of opportunity, because today within the Reckoning project where we document war crimes, we have the Syrian lawyers and we have the American writer who covered the war in Africa, in Middle East, and they all speak about accountability. But I'm speaking that, like, yes, the part this war is possible and the brutality of this war is possible, it's because of the Russian impunity, which had been there in Chechnya, in Syria. But of course, these were the closed governments where there was lack of press, lack of the people telling the story. And here we have something else. So here they are on the spotlight. So the criminals might be finally caught on the spotlight in the environment when it's possible, and there is really, honestly, no obstacle apart from our intellectual capacity to think that it's possible. Therefore, that's what for me is happening in Ukraine. And then coming into the world, in another capacity, while I'm speaking as a Ukrainian, speaking about the larger world, now, within the Public Interest Journalism Lab and the different project, which we call Connecting the Continents, we're bringing a group of the people like them, like you, to Ukraine, who are like the key intellectual and the journalists and the editors from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, to Ukraine, to fill this place, to be here, to be among us. So we have this very interesting experience 3 weeks ago with a group of the Latin American senior editors. And then I was reconfirmed in something which I believe strongly and firmly, and as a journalist focusing on the human rights, in the idea of the human security, instead of the idea of discussing the global security as such without speaking about the human security. Because as a journalist, not being the analyst, I always saw that it's very hard to shape the narrative if we speak about the very general things. Colonialism, empires, NATO. Then we get into the discussion about the proxy wars, about whose empire is better, whose empire is worse, and who committed more crimes, how it affected you. And what I find the only way to resonate, this is a human story. So I was, struck by how a Nicaraguan editor would speak, strongly and firmly about his impression of talking to the survivor from Kherson, a lady who kind of came from the cellar and been tortured in Kherson, and how he connected this experience. How the Mexican analyst was, after visiting Izum and seeing mass graves, was writing about the mass graves in Sonora Desert, where the warlords and the drag lords, were killing the Mexicans, and how this, violence should be stopped. And the Uruguayan editor who would speak about the necessity of the documenting war crimes, because they had a similar experience in 80s and 70s. And I think these common wounds are there, and they are and we live in the world with so many wounds. And it's in fact so deep and so close and so human that if we get into this real discussion about, our traumas, but very honest and very with all the problems, I do think this is a way to reconnect. And something else to add, when we were speaking also with Argentinians, and I was speaking about the Pope, which is the discussion about the Argentinian Pope, for the Ukrainians doing not always something what we want and telling, thinking about this war, and I was explaining that he does things about the war as a war of big empires, rather than about the colonial, a colony against the colonizer, as we see that, and it's very hard to shape, his opinion, the opinion of the Pope. So my thinking was talking to everybody, and that's what I think where we have a chance to shape the world. Today, we live in the world of the negative solidarity, And there are very few realistic messages of this positive solidarity. We live in a world where we speak about the enemy of the enemy is my friend. Somehow we stop to believe in the real positive solidarity of support, human rights, freedoms, because they maybe for some people became just words. They misused by the politicians. A lot of people don't live through their values. So I think that maybe this place, exactly in this platform, in this space where we're discussing about how actually real are these issues as democracy, human rights, inclusiveness, solidarity, that it's something very practical, it's not theoretical. The freedom is real, the justice is real. So can we really, maybe shape this a different, more positive narrative with not theory, but putting a particular actions into the words we use?
Yeah, I think I really appreciate there's so many things we can pick up there, but the first one that I kind of want to point us to is exactly as you say. On the one hand, there is this idea that, Europe talks about itself as a sort of values-based project and all of this, but those in fact are universal values in some way, and we could be framing them that way. At the meantime, at the exact same moment that these are in some ways universal values, the European Union itself struggles in some ways to follow through on those, right? We saw last year at the sort of struggle to envision what it would actually look like to include Ukraine into the EU. A lot of progress has been made there, steps are moving forward. But part of that is, as Ivan says, a sort of European understanding of itself, right? As beyond military, as a post-national project, as a post-heroism project. Karl-Henrik, I wonder how you think about those things and this challenge for Europe and the way that, in fact, Ukraine could help Europe rethink itself.
I come there, I just want to answer this question about the immediate reaction that you posed to Ivan to begin with as well. I'm Swedish, I'm living in Vienna since 20 years, but I'm Swedish. And for the Swedes, the 24th of February 2022 was an earthquake. Within a few weeks, 200 years of neutrality was abandoned, and Sweden applied in haste for membership in NATO. Sweden is still not a member of NATO because of Turkish reluctance to accept us, but the shift is enormous within Swedish society. This has been part of Swedish self-identity since 200 years. Now, coming back to your concrete question about post-nationalism, post-heroism, again taking the Swedish-Austrian perspective. Sweden and Austria joined the European Union at the same time back in the mid-1990s. Up until then, this neutrality perspective had been our guiding star in both countries. Joining the European Union practically meant that we gave up some of that, but it was not. We were not aware of that. It was not spoken of in any way. And what we learned, if we hadn't learned it before, was that the European integration project was a project of, it was a post-national project, and it was a post-heroic project. The post-heroism was basically about that we lived in post-bellum times, right? The post-national one was partly what Ivan was talking about before, that borders in all senses didn't matter anymore, economic interdependence was the way forward. How is this is my critical and urgent question, how is this post-national project, this post-heroic project, compatible with the ongoing Ukrainian project, which to a large degree is national, not necessarily nationalist, but one of nation building, community building, and to a large extent, is also characterized by impressive heroism, bravery and heroism. Well, looking at it from the start, just like that, it's not compatible, right? This is what many analysts say as well. But there are many dangers in comparing what is happening now to the Second World War. But there are some items there that are actually quite helpful. In 1939, Thomas Mann was sitting in Stockholm writing a speech that was going to be held on the International Pen Congress that was to be opened on the 1st of September. He wrote a long speech called The Problem of Freedom. In that speech, that was never held because on the 1st of September, Hitler invaded Poland. Thomas Mann elaborated on the concept of freedom, and him, having been an unpolitical man, came to the conclusion that what we need to do now is to re-evaluate the concept with which we have understood the world so far. We must start to use words like truth, freedom, justice, without any ironic distance, in the way that we have done since in the last decades, he writes, right? Is that not extremely similar to the situation that we have right now? 3 years before Thomas Mann wrote that speech on freedom, he held a speech in Budapest. It's called on humanity and humanism. There he identifies the concept and idea of Europe with one of humanism. But he says, what is that humanism worth if it cannot defend itself? It's time for a militant liberalism. This is what he says. Humanism, liberalism needs, democracy needs to put on its armor. So you can think that this is bellicose talk, but it was in a situation that is very similar to the one we have right now. I will finish now by reminding you of exactly, more or less, exactly 20 years ago, on the 31st of May, 2003, Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida, the two German and French philosophers, launched a project that they thought would trigger a renewal of Europe. The title of their article that was published in Le Monde and in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung was "After the War, the Rebirth of Europe." And what goes through this text is the strong belief that we live in post-bellum times. And the only way, and that military strengths had nothing to do with contemporary politics. And the only reason why Habermas and Derrida could come to that conclusion was that in their endeavor, that included thinkers like Umberto Eco or Fernando Savater in Spain or Richard Rorty, was that no one east of Berlin was included in this so-called European-wide endeavor, which made them blind on at least one eye, and went straight into this trap of thinking that military power is not important. Eastern Europe is not important. 20 years ago, After the War was the title. Yeah, we can learn something from what is happening now.
Certainly we can. You know, Ivan, I wonder if we could come back to something that Nataliya mentioned, is this negative solidarity. Because I think one of the things that we've perhaps been, one of the ways to understand what we've been witnessing is a sort of new fragmentation happening in different ways, perhaps, than we'd seen before. You know, some talk about the return of geopolitics, but actually that's perhaps not what we're seeing. And I wonder how you are thinking about that.
The biggest problem for any universal solidarity is as simple as this. Is it possible to love all the children in the world in the way you're loving your own children? And it is very difficult. Listen, the same polls that during the Syria war crisis said that they are not able to basically host 20,000 people, basically hosted 2 million Ukrainians. I'm saying this because we should not be, universal solidarity exists, but the intensity of this solidarity cannot be the same. And I'm going to give you some polling data. There is a lot of talk how the Europe is divided between East and West, and by the way, this is true. Poles fear, as a result of this war occupation, Germans and France fear much more nuclear war. But do you know what is, if you see the opinion polls about the Ukrainian war, what is the major and most interesting divide? You see the borders of the old empires. Basically, countries that have been part of the Russian Empire, we are not talking Soviet Union, classical Russian Empire, identify it with Ukraine as if this is their war. You have the Balts, you have the Poles. Then you have the Ottomans, countries like Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece. Listen, we also suffer, and of course, 1/3 of the ammunition Soviet standards of the Ukrainian army is the Bulgarian production. But to be honest, the level of identification with Ukraine is much weaker. The idea is, yes, it's bad, it's not our empire. And then you go to the Habsburgs, and they're very much in between. I'm saying this because one of the important things that we are discovering with this war is the return of the long history. Suddenly, the communist period disappeared, which was, if it was everything about the Cold War, the reaction should be basically similar in Eastern Europe. It is not. And it goes to many other things that basically we have forgotten. And I always try to make this argument. Europeans, we can have a common dreams, but the nightmares are strictly national. When the war started, it triggers certain type of a historically rooted fears that are very specific from place to place. And this is why I do believe that the negative, and this is why solidarity is so different, and this is why it's so not easy to explain to the people quite obvious things. Russian-Ukrainian war is not difficult in moral terms. I remember the famous story after the end of the World War I. There was this famous negotiations in Weimar, and a senior German diplomat went to the French leader Clemenceau and said, "Sir, probably in 100 years, people are going to see the war differently." And then Clemenceau said, "Probably, but nobody can claim that Belgium attacked Germany." And from this point of view, you can see many things, but nobody can claim that Ukraine attacked Russia. I'm saying all this because even on the level of this kind of a moral clarity, historical experience is going back. And there is one thing that in my view, and any time when a foreigner comes, we feel this kind of a guilt because nevertheless of what you are telling you, and nevertheless how genuinely people are interested and supportive, none of us can share the intensity of the people being part of it. Listen, you come here, you stay for 3 days, you hear the sirens, and then you go home. And it is one thing for 3 days, and it's totally different for 3 years. And I'm saying this because this is also the problem of solidarity. You can identify for how long. My last point, when we started, I was trying to remember how many panels of what this and that is changing the world I have been staying for the last 30 years. First was about the Yugoslav wars. Listen, when the war started, many European leaders said, this is the first war in Europe after 1945. And the Yugoslavs were just depressed. What about their war? And of course, the scale here is different. But the story is that then we believed that the Yugoslav war was so important that this is going to teach people this, that this is not going to be repeated. Listen, not so simple. And then 9/11. How many basically conferences? Do you remember how unified American society was on the day after 9/11 and how fragmented and polarized it is today? So as a result of it, in my view, everything is changing the world for a while. And this is why it's important to change the world, but the most important is not to allow the world to change yourself. Because keeping your own identity and resilience is critically important to live in a world in which I do believe it's not going to be many boring days.
This is, I think this is excellent, this point that you're going to change the world, but for how long? And so then the question becomes, is systemic change possible, right? Can you use a moment, a juncture, to change the international system, to change the way institutions are functioning, all of that? And Nataliya, here I actually wanted to bring in a little bit the work that the Reckoning Project is doing to rethink ways that stories can be told that bring together the possibilities of justice, whether internationally or domestically, with storytelling, with all of that. So if Ukrainians are living through this experience, right, there has to be some way that then that can influence the way the world is functioning going forwards. And so do you see opportunities for this in the justice system in other ways as you're thinking about this and talking to people?
So I all the time think about the opportunities because that's the only way for us to go forward. And I do think that things might, of course, change because, you know, the war in Iraq changed a lot. We live today in the legacy, you know, the lack of kind of willingness and reluctance to send arms is a clear result of the American invasion to Iraq. You know, not just that, but it was like the top of everything. So we see that, you know, we're living for 20 years. But I think that Ukraine really can shape that. If we speak about the opportunities, yes, I think that I'm starting for something different. I had a difficult encounter with one of the senior European editors who was trying to challenge, you know, how you would fight fatigue, Ukrainian fatigue. My answer is always, you know, like, don't we entertain you enough? Isn't like already too big to invent something worse? But I also thought, like, you know, that's a challenge for the others to think how you tell the Ukrainian story for your audiences. It cannot be told just by the Ukrainians. It really depends on a lot. It's not just for us to search for these paths of relations. But when I was answering, you know, I'm saying, like, look, the difference is, of course, it's not that critical because you are interested in Russia. You're not interested in Ukraine, to be honest, be fair. You'll be still interested in Russia because it's a big country. It sounds very unfair, but it is. So, you know, I'm not very much afraid of that. But the second point, you know, there is this universal story of David and Goliath. Which probably is something very, very unusual. But I think that there is an issue of this empathy fatigue. Because we see so much horror, so it's so very, very hard already to relate to that. And after some point, when you see that the cause is useless, to be very cynical, you kind of think like, okay, I stopped to think about Syria. I stopped to think about the female protest in Iran. I lose my solidarity to the activists in Hong Kong and, you know, Myanmar got it all, you know, the other way around after some time. The Venezuelans. So you really think like, no, I can't any longer. And probably the same would happen to Ukraine. And all of a sudden, there is something different happening for a long time. My answer is really, actually, the Ukraine managed, and it's not by chance, but partially by chance, in 2014, build a democratic society and the democratic country. So it's not just like some nice opposition group fighting. There is a whole democratic state which has this moral position and legitimacy to call for arms, to have the legit army to call for arms. But the same is with the justice. So we are working on the project which can make you feel doomed, absolutely. You know, here in this valley, later you can see the Reckoning Project documentaries. There are 9 documentaries of the major war crimes committed within the last year. Would it be Yahidne would be attack on the Kramatorsk train station, or the shopping mall in Kremenchuk, which would have the 1 year since then. And of course, it's difficult. You know, we speak, our team within the last year spoke to 300, at least, like, made in-depth interviews, testimonies of the direct witnesses of the war crimes, which is, you know, very sad. It's really absolutely tragic. And of course, you can be exhausted by that. But from something I begin, you know, I treat today these stories and the way we do our journalism not as reporting the tragedies, because tragedies make you feel powerless, but as the crimes. And if there was a crime, there was somebody who committed this crime, and there should be accountability, so there should be justice. And as I said, like, the circumstances give us all the opportunities to, you know, to find those people accountable, to stop the thing. And I again would quote our Syrian lawyer, who said that even if I don't, and that's his quote, I understand him, but he said, like, even if not everybody would be punished who committed the crimes against Ukrainians, the people living in the Ukrainian territory, by the Russians, maybe we would create the ground for better tribunals, for better justice, because it's built upon that. The trials of the ICC was built on previous crimes. It's developing, and we have better political situation. Maybe, you know, we can debate better with the, you know, Russia being on the right side in case of the in the UN Security Council. You know, that's one thing, but still. So I think, and there I'm coming to the also talk to the Argentinian lawyer, who also helping the Ukrainian government to work on the international trials. And he really said, like, that his advice, it's really not come to say, help us because we deserve to be helped. And then you get engaged in this discussion, was it the right trial against Bush? Was there the trial after the Iraq war? And you get into this whataboutism type of the discussion. But to say, can we actually shape the system in which we can finally make the international law working, that there would be trials, and if things are committed in your territory, there would be better instruments? Because, for instance, the problem for me is with the international war crimes, as a journalist, not as a lawyer, that they are not considered often as crimes. So for me, the logical question is, if somebody, you know, has killed somebody, or if somebody has, you know, been in the traffic accident, we do not debate, is this person good or not? Do we support this person or we don't support this person? Is him on my side or not, my relative or not? What history I had with this person? What is my legacy of the relations? But you actually send this person to court and to decide, and that is justice. So for me today, beyond the discussion we need to have, I think there should be a totally separate discussion on, you know, the international justice system, that it's a crime, and disregarding what is your historic relations to the people should be put into justice. And that's the type of storytelling we want to do, to shape the idea that these are the powerful, weak, powerless victims, to the ideas that these are the people who are, they are not the victims, they are witnesses of the crimes, and they do incredible things. They're telling their stories despite of the trauma. They are ready to testify in the courts, overcome themselves, pursue. In order, justice happens for one reason: it shouldn't happen to somebody else in future.
You know, I think there's a way in which, as we're talking about the sort of international justice system, international organizations, the way that they're functioning, you know, even particularly here, I think of, for example, the Ukrainian Helsinki Group, which recognized that from 1975 on, there was an international agreement in place that was hypocritical and flawed from the very start. And yet they refused to accept that and instead continued to push for the ideals of that to be lived out. You know, Henrik, I actually remember from January or February of 2022, a discussion that we were having about the possibility of this war. And the OSCE was something that you were pointing to in particular, that we were living in a post-Helsinki world. How are you thinking about that now? How has your thinking changed?
Well, the problem with the OSCE was that it, like all other international organizations, didn't react 9 years ago. And 9 years ago was the clear break with everything that the Helsinki Agreement or the Paris Treaty or you know, any of these international agreements were about, that were explicitly talking about that there are no such things as sphere of influence and the integrity of independent states and whatever. And this is this kind of original sin, not having reacted back in February or March 2014, hampers these institutions still. So it's very easy to be pessimistic when it comes to, let's say, the relationship between Ukraine and international institutions. However, let me try to be slightly positive and remind you, I make the disclaimer once again, it's very dangerous, or it's always not always good to make the comparisons with Germany in this particular context. But let me remind us all about the fact that Germany became a member of NATO in 1955. Only 10 years since this country was bringing Armageddon over this continent, murdering and killing millions and millions of people, at a time when this country was divided. So at least it's possible to argue that when, of course it was not GDR that became a member of NATO, but still, there was no control over the territory. So no one can come and say that it hasn't been you know, cases in the past where extremely radical decisions, and one of those will be necessary, I think, in order to integrate Ukraine into several of these international organizations, that has not been done before. And if it has done, I mean, all differences yeah, aside. As far as the EU is concerned, there are attempts, you know, to approach this in quite creative ways. The European Stability Initiative, which is based partly in Vienna, has developed a concept, a model where Moldavia, Ukraine, but also the Western Balkans could become part of the single market, which is a much, much easier way of integrating them in a system. There are lots of critical questions one can pose to that. Is it interesting for Ukraine to be only part of the single market as an economic community when the struggle here right now is about political freedom? And so there are all arguments to be had here, but there are, you know, initiatives, and people are thinking about this. The UN is probably the most difficult institution to kind of reform. Yesterday, the UN announced that Russia has been put on the so-called list of shame. And yesterday, I happened to be in Borodyanka, seeing the results of the Russian bombings on the 1st of March and on the 2nd of March. And on one building, or the remains of a building that was still standing, was a huge banner and it said, both in Ukrainian and in English, kick Russia out of the UN, and it's a hashtag UN Russia, whatever that is, un-Russia UN or something like that, UN Russia UN. And it seems to me that from a very human point of view, that is a more reasonable reaction to what all the atrocities that this war has brought than saying to the invaders that they should do some corner time and go into the corner and be a bit shamed. However, it's not easy.
Yeah, and this is getting right back to Nataliya's point about impunity and the importance of understanding what we're going to do about that. I'm being informed that we have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure that we have time for some questions from the audience, so please.
Hi, everyone. I think at the moment of time, we all can agree that Ukraine have possibility to change the world. But here is the question, is the world prepared enough for this change?
We'll take a second question now as well, so I saw in the front there.
Hello, Alevtina Kahidze is an artist. How it's possible for Ukrainians that we will talk to other colonized nations, we are the same, still we are white. How we can be mobilized with them in order, let's say, to be on one table and maybe discuss which empire is worst. So recently I received a comment from my Polish friend that US is the worst empire, and actually I answered, I prefer to discuss this question with the nations which were colonized by the US.
Nataliya, do you want to start with that one?
The first question
is the world ready for Ukraine to change it?
They are interconnected, the answer would be. I do think that I'm very humbled. I'm a Ukrainian, so I think I feel what injustice we do feel. But I don't think we should take for granted that everybody would feel the same. Also because we never felt others' injustice. We are just opening to understand something. We never had in our lifetime. You know, I was writing a story about the veterans of the Iraqi war. I'm speaking about the war 23rd, the Iraqi invasion, the US invasion to Iraq, in 2011, and I was like puzzled by the idea of the veteran being in their 20s, because for me the veterans were the old guys at that time. I think since now we can feel a lot of troubles. So my idea is for Ukraine, before we expect the world automatically change, to listen and to find the things. Now, while preparing for the trip, for the visit of the African editors and intellectuals, you know, I'm reading a lot about Africa, and I feel very humbled that I cannot come up with terms like colonialism and trying to them to feel compassion to us with the level of atrocities they live through. I give a very, you know, maybe controversial example, Alevtina, you would understand. We feel some pain when there would be a Russian emigre to Berlin complaining how difficult for them to live after leaving Moscow compared to what we live through. It just feels so weird comparison. And wherever I read anything about what a lot of African countries in Africa lived through, I'm just seeing like, yes, we live through Holodomor, yes, we live through this, but to be honest, like now tell them that, you know, feel compassion to us, it's just a bit too much. Find something different, you know, search for some other things. You know, so for instance, my answer would be, can we speak about how we can fight against police brutality like we did in the Maidan? How we can find some, you know, like genuine small things So my answer would be always, instead of using the general terms like colony empires, that would be the third, like the third or the fifth position. Start from the very real things. We were on the streets and our police beat us in 2014. You were in the streets and you know how is it. That's how our fight against Russia started in this war. And like getting to the very real examples, because we just have a different metaphors, we have a different vocabularies for this world. And erase terms, speak about the actions and real feelings without naming. And that would be the first step. And then later, maybe we would reach out that actually we speak about the same things, we're just using the different words.
Ivan, do you want to jump in there?
Thank you very much. Fortunately, I have never divorced, but nobody can be worse than the husband that you just divorced. So from this point of view, you cannot expect, and for me the most important is not to push the load to compete who feels worst. You cannot win this. You always, because it's for you. And from this point of view, I don't believe that you can, either we can basically identify with many things that is happening in other places. By the way, much more people have been killed in Ethiopia than in Ukraine. These days. But listen, can you easily identify with this? This is awful, and every normal person knows it. But can you really go everywhere and to know what is happening? In my view, from this point of view, is first to try really to talk for those who understand that this has also consequences for them. And not to have over expectations on people. Because when we have over expectations on people, we get very much disappointed. And the second is the limits. Listen, we're talking about Americans doing this and that. I remember this famous statement by a very senior American diplomat who said, in Iraq, we interfere and we occupied. It doesn't work. In Syria, we did not interfere and we did not occupy. It didn't work. In Libya, we interfere, we did not occupy. It didn't work. From this point of view, the very fact that everything is just the problem of our will to do this is also not true. There are limits. And knowing the limits is also having a normal expectations on people. You have the right to expect that people will know who is the aggressor and who is the victim. Because this is clear. In this case, this is clear. To believe that people are going to experience this war in the way you're experiencing, by the way, it's clear for Africans, it's clear for Latin Americans, and this is not about America, and this is not about Japan, and this is not about China. On the other side, we should be also clear that countries have interests. And by the way, this is true even for Ukraine. If you talk to some of the Belarusian opposition, they're going to say, why so less solidarity with us? For very obvious reasons. You don't want the country to be attacked from the Belarusian territory. Is this legitimate? Yes. Is this a tragic decision? Yes. By the way, Ukraine didn't vote against China on the Human Rights Council. It is said, yes. Was they right? I do believe yes. You don't want to antagonize China in this very moment. So from this point of view, I do believe the most important is there are certain things that you can ask from others. And the most is to have the clear statement. Who did what? Who attacked whom? And this is something that everybody you can expect. To believe that solidarity is the only game in town, to believe that basically every state is going to do this and that, totally neglecting their concrete interests, this is, in my view, naive. And I'm going to end up with something very beautiful that I read, who said, geopolitics starts with maps, but it ends with Shakespeare. It ends with a really morally difficult questions that are not just the problem of what is right and what is wrong now, but what you can afford and you cannot afford.
Thank you. Karl-Henrik.
Yeah, trying very briefly to address the concrete question, is the world prepared to be changed? Limiting myself to Europe, which is always dangerous to do, but I will take the risk. I think this is, Europe is already changing. And rapidly, learning the lessons that Ukraine is teaching Europe when it comes to realizing that democracy, freedom, certain values are worth and needs to be protected with all possible means, also with weapons and violence and deterrence. So Europe is learning. I think the world or Europe is also, European intellectuals are at the moment in a learning process concerning the language I tried to describe via Thomas Mann. In what way are we using these words? Freedom, justice, democracy, and so on. And so what do they actually mean? Thomas Mann was, up until, let's say, 1934 or so, a self-defined, unpolitical man. He wrote a book called The Views of an Unpolitical Man. And he changed rapidly because things happened, right? And this is what this learning process is taking place at the moment. The institutional change is much more difficult and has very much to do with the self-interest discourse and context that Ivan mentioned.
I want to thank the three of you for this discussion. Thank you for all of the topics we've touched on. And in fact, as we talk about revisiting concepts such as freedom and others, very soon Tim Snyder will be joining via screen to talk precisely about freedom and what that means. So thank you all.